We're on chapter 9 of The Sheep Pig by Dick King-Smith. Was it Babe? "Go home, pig," said Farmer Hoggett in a voice that was so quiet and cold that Babe hardly recognised it. Bewildered, he trotted off obediently, while behind him the farmer picked up the dead ewe and carried it to the Land Rover. Then, with Fly's help, he began the task of rescuing those sheep that were caught or stuck, and of making sure that no others were badly hurt. This done, he left Fly to guard the flock, and he drove home. Back at the farm, Babe simply felt very, very sad. The sky was still cloudless, the air still crisp, but this was a very different pig from the one that had cantered carefree up the hill not half an hour ago. In those 30 minutes, he had seen naked fear and cruelty and death. And now, to cap it all, the boss was angry with him, had sent him home in a sort of disgrace. What had he done wrong? He had only done his duty, as a good sheep pig should. He sat in the doorway of the stables and watched as the Land Rover drove into the yard, poor Ma's head lolling loosely over the back. He saw the boss get out and go into the house, and then, a few minutes later, came out again, carrying something in the crook of one arm, a long thing, a kind of black shiny tube, and walked towards him. And that's what he's carrying. "Come, pig," said Farmer Hoggett in that same cold voice, and strode past him into the stables, while at the same moment, inside the farmhouse, the telephone began to ring, and then stopped as Mrs. Hoggett picked it up. Obediently, Babe followed the farmer into the dark interior. It was not so dark, however, that he could not see clearly that the boss was pointing the black shiny tube at him, and he sat down again and waited, supposing that perhaps it was some machine for giving out food, and that some quite unexpected surprise would come out of its two small round mouths, held now quite close to his face. At that instant, Mrs. Hoggett's voice sounded across the yard, calling her husband's name from the open kitchen window. He frowned, lowered the shiny tube, and poked his head round the stable door. "Oh, there you are," called Mrs. Hoggett. "What does thee think, then? That was the police, that was. They're ringing every farmer in the district to warn them there's sheep worrying dogs about. They killed 6 sheep t'other side of the valley only last night. They've been seen, they have. 2 of them it is. A big black un and a little brown un. They say to shoot 'em on sight if you do see 'em. You better get back up the hill and see if ours are all right. Do you want me to fetch your gun?" "No," said Farmer Hoggett. "It's all right," he said. He waited till his wife had shut the window and disappeared, and then he walked out into the sunlight, with Babe following him. "Sit, pig," he said, but now his voice was warm and kindly again. He looked closely at the trusting face turned up to his, and saw, sticking to the side of Babe's mouth, some hairs, some black hairs, and a few brown ones too. What does that mean? He shook his head in wonder, and that slow grin spread over his face. "I reckon you gave them something to worry about," he said, and he broke the gun and took out the cartridges. Meanwhile, Fly, standing guard up in the far field, was terribly agitated. She knew, of course, that some dogs will attack sheep, sometimes even the very dogs trained to look after them, but surely not her sheep pig. Surely Babe could not have done such a thing. Yet there he had been at the centre of that scene of chaos, blood-stained and standing over a dead ewe. What would the boss do to him? What perhaps had he already done? Yet she could not leave these fools to find out. At least, though, she suddenly realised they could tell her what had happened, if the shock hadn't driven what little sense they had out of their stupid heads. Never before in her long life had Fly sunk to engaging a sheep in conversation. They were there to be ordered about like soldiers, and like soldiers never to answer back. She approached the nearest one with distaste, and it promptly backed away from her. "Stand still, fool," she barked, "and tell me who chased you. Who killed that old one?" "Wolf," said the sheep automatically. Fly growled with annoyance. Was that the only word the half-wits knew? She put the question differently. "Was it the pig that chased you? Was it Babe?" she said. "Babe," bleated the sheep eagerly. "What does that mean, bonehead?" barked Fly. "Was it or wasn't it?" "Wolf," said the sheep. Somehow, Fly controlled her anger at the sheep's stupidity. "I must know what happened," she thought. "Babe's always talking about being polite to these woolly idiots. I'll have to try it. I must know." She took a deep breath. "Please," she said. The sheep, which had begun to graze, raised its head sharply and stared at her with an expression of total amazement. "Say that again," it said, and a number of others, overhearing, moved towards the collie. "Please," said Fly, swallowing hard, "could you be kind enough to tell me?" "Hark!" interrupted the first sheep. "Hark! Hark!" Whereupon the whole flock ran and gathered. They stood in silence, every eye fixed wonderingly on her, every mouth hanging open. "Nincompoops," thought Fly. "Just when I wanted to ask one quietly, the whole fat-headed lot come round. But I must know the truth about my Babe, however terrible it is." "Please," she said once more in a loud, in a voice choked with the effort of being humble, "could you be kind enough to tell me what happened this morning? Did Babe—" But she got no further, for at the mention of the pig's name, the whole flock burst into a cry of "Babe!" Listening for the first time ever to what the sheep were actually saying, Fly could hear individual voices competing to make themselves heard in what was nothing less than a hymn of praise. "Babe came! He saved us! He drove the wolves away! He made them pay! Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray!" What a sense of relief flooded over her as she heard and understood the words of the sheep. It had been sheep warriors after all, and her boy had come to the rescue. He was not the villain. He was the hero. Hoggett and Babe heard the racket as they climbed the hill, and the farmer sent the pig ahead, fearing that perhaps the warriors had returned. Under cover of the noise, Babe arrived on the scene unnoticed by Fly, just in time to hear her reply. "Oh, thank you," she cried to the flock. "Thank you all so much for telling me. How kind of you." "Gosh, Mum," said a voice behind her. "What's come over you?" Chapter 10. Get It Off by Heart. Because Babe had now saved the flock not only from rustlers but also from the warriors, the Hoggetts could not do too much for him. Because he was a pig, though Farmer Hoggett increasingly found himself thinking of pig as a dog and fed him accordingly, they gave him unlimited supplies of what they supposed he could not have too much of, namely food. Because he was strong-minded and revelled in his newfound speed, he ate sparingly of it. That means not very much. Because there was always a lot left over, Fly became fat, and the chickens chubby, and the ducks dumpy, and the very rats and mice rolled happily about the stables with stomachs full to bursting. Mrs. Hoggett even took to calling Babe to the back door to feed him some titbit or other that she thought he might particularly fancy. And from here it was but a short step to inviting him into the house, which one day she did. When the farmer came in for his tea, he found not only Fly, but also Pig lying happily asleep beside the Arga cooker. And afterwards, when he sat down in his armchair in the sitting room and switched on the television, Babe came to sit next to him, and they watched the 6 o'clock news together. "He likes it," said Hoggett to his wife when she came into the room. Mrs. Hoggett nodded her head a great many times, and as usual had a few words to say on the subject. "Dear little chap, though you can't call him a little no longer. He's growed so much, why, he's big enough to you know what, not that we're ever shall now, over my dead body, though I hopes it ain't, if you see what I do mean. Just look at him. We should have brought him in the house long ago. No reason why not. Is there now?" "He might mess the carpet," said Farmer Hoggett. "Never," cried Mrs. Hoggett, shaking her head the entire time that she was speaking. "He's no more likely to mess than he is to fly. He'll ask to go out when he wants to do his do's, just like a good clean dog would. Got more brains than a dog, he has. Why, 'twouldn't surprise me to hear he was rounding them old sheep up a yawn. 'Twouldn't, honestly, though I suppose you'd think I'm daft." Farmer Hoggett grinned to himself. He did not tell his wife what she had never yet noticed, that all the work of the farm was now done by the sheep pig, and he had no intention of telling her of the final part of his plan, which was nothing less than to enter Pig in the sternest of all contests, the Grand Challenge Sheepdog Trials, open to all comers. Never in his working life had he owned an animal good enough to compete in these trials. Now at last he had one, and he was not going to be stopped from realising his ambition by the fact that it was a pig. In a couple of weeks they would be competing against the best sheepdogs in the country, would be appearing, in fact, on that very television screen that they were now watching. "No, you're not daft," he said. "And you won't half get a surprise when you sit here and watch it," he thought, "and so will a lot of other folks." His plan was simple. He would appear at the Grand Challenge finals with Fly, and at the last possible moment swap her for Pig. But then it would be too late for anyone to stop him. It didn't matter what happened afterwards. They could disqualify him, fine him, send him to prison, anything, as long as he could run Pig. Just one glorious run, just to show them all. And they couldn't say they hadn't been warned. The name was there on the entry form. He had been worried, for he was a truthful man, that the heading might say name of dog, and then whatever he put would be a lie. But he'd been lucky. Name of competitor, the form said. The simple truth. Name of competitor, F. Hoggett. Name of entry, Pig. The simple truth. Shepherds usually give their dogs short names, like Jip or Moss. It's so much quicker and easier than shouting Bartholomew or Wilhelmina, and though someone might say Pig, that's a funny name, no one in their wildest dreams would guess the truth. The 2 weeks before the Grand Challenge trials were 2 weeks of concentrated activity. Apart from Mrs. Hoggett, who was as usual was busy with household duties, everyone now knew what was going on. To begin with, Hoggett altered the practice course, cutting out all the frills like the plank bridge over the stream, and building a new course as like as possible to what he thought they might face on the day. As soon as Fly saw this, she became convinced that the plan which she had suspected was actually going to be put into operation, and she told the sheep, with whom she was now on speaking terms. Every night, of course, she and Babe talked endlessly about the coming challenge before they settled to sleep. In the stable still, though the Hoggetts would have been perfectly happy for Babe to sleep in the house. So well-mannered was he. Thoughtful as ever, Babe was anxious, not about his own abilities, but about his foster mother's feelings. He felt certain she would have given her dog teeth to compete in the national trials, the dream of every sheepdog, yet she must sit and watch him. "Are you sure you don't mind, Mum?" he asked. Fly's reply was as practical as ever. "Listen, Babe," she said. "First of all, it wouldn't matter whether I minded or not. The boss is going to run you, no doubt of it. Second, I'm too old and too fat, And anyway, I was only ever good enough for small local competitions. And lastly, I'll be the happiest collie in the world if you win. And you can win. Do you really think so? I'm sure of it, said Fly firmly. But all the same, she was anxious too, about one thing. She knew that the sheep pig, speedy as he now was, would still be much slower than the dogs, especially on the outrun. But equally, she was confident that he could make this up by the promptness with which the sheep obeyed his requests. Here at home, they shot through gaps and round obstacles as quick as a flash, never putting a foot wrong. The ones to be shed nipped out of the ring like lightning, and at the final penning, they popped in the instant that the boss opened the gate. But that was here at home. What would strange sheep do? How would they react to Babe? Would he be able to communicate with them in time? For there would be none to waste. She determined to ask the flock. And one evening, when Babe and the boss were watching television, she trotted off up the hill. Since that first time, when she had been forced to speak civilly to them, they no longer cried wolf at her, and now they gathered around attentively at her first words that were carefully polite. "Good evening," said Fly. "I wonder if you could be as kind enough to help me. I've a little problem." And she explained it, speaking slowly and carefully. For sheep are stupid, she said to herself. Nobody will ever persuade me otherwise. "You see what I mean?" she finished. "There'll be these strange sheep, and I'm sure they'll do what he tells them, asks them, eventually, but it'll all take time, explaining things. The last creature they'll be expecting to see is a pig, and they might just bolt at the sight of him before he even gets a chance to speak to them." "Password," said several voices. "What do you mean?" Fly said. "Password, password, password," said many voices now, speaking slowly and carefully. For wolves are stupid, they said to themselves. Nobody will ever persuade them otherwise. What our Babe's got to do," said one, "is to learn what all of us had learned when we was little lambs." "'Tis a saying, see," said another, "as lambs do learn at their mother's hocks. And then wherever we do go, to market or to another farm, we won't never come to no harm so long as we do say the password. And if our Babe do say it today, why then they won't never run away." Fly felt her patience slipping, but she controlled herself, knowing how important this information could be. "Please," she said quietly, "please will you tell me the password?" For a long moment the flock stood silent, the only movement a turning of heads as they looked at one another. Fly could sense that they were nerving themselves to tell this old age secret, to give away to a wolf of all things this treasured countersign. Then, "'Tis for Babe," someone said. "'Tis for his sake." "Ah," they all said softly. "Ah." And then with one voice they began to intone. "I may be ewe, I may be ram, I may be mutton, may be lamb, but on the hoof or on the hook, I bain't so stupid as I look." Then, by general consent, they began to move away, grazing as they went. "Is that it?" Fly called after them. "Is that the password?" And a murmur came back. "Ah." "But what does it all mean, Mum?" said Babe that night when she told him. "All that stuff about 'I may be you' and other words I don't understand. It doesn't make sense to me." "That doesn't matter, dear," said Fly. "You just get it off by heart. It may make all the difference on the day." And next time we'll be reading chapter 11. Today is the day, and I think it's the last chapter. See you then.